Hi, welcome to the next chapter on the Gukesh QGD. In this chapter, we would be covering White's sixth move alternatives after d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, knight f6, cd, ed, bishop g5, bishop b4. This is the starting point of the chapter. In the previous chapters, we covered all the sidelines after move 7 and 8. In this chapter, we would be focusing on White's alternatives on the sixth move. So, in general, the previous chapters were not that forcing for White. What do I mean by that? White basically had tries which were positional in nature, and thus, even if we made some inaccuracies, we were able to survive very easily. But in this chapter, I would ask you to pay some attention to the main line because it's crazy complicated and you do need to know and understand the logic behind a lot of moves. So please pay special attention to the main line of this chapter. All right. So the main line for this chapter is Queen B3 with an idea which we have already seen a lot of times. White wants to play Queen D5 or Knight D5 at some point after Bishop into F6 when this bishop moves. We also need to check out some sidelines. Okay, if White plays Knight F3 here, we play Knight BD7 and we transpose back to the Manhattan. If White plays Queen C2, trying to play A3 and getting some sort of different position on the board, we can play C5, but the simplest move is to play H6. White's testing try is Bishop H4, but after G5, Bishop G3, Knight E4, White has nothing better than playing E3, where we transpose to one of the main lines of the Gukesh QGD. And that brings us back to move 6, where White's Rook C1 is one of White's other sidelines with the idea of playing A3 and taking back with the Rook. But as we know, defending the knight with Rook in this particular sideline is not so great, and we can continue with the typical H6, winning a tempo over the bishop. The bishop goes back, and because the bishop has gone back and there is no pressure on this diagonal, we can easily play c5. Our idea is to exploit that White's king side is not developed and we are challenging White's center. Obviously, there are two moves which we need to look at, e3 and d into c5. By the way, a3 is not good because after bishop c3, rook into c3, we have the typical c4, gaining space on the queen side and preparing b5, a5, b4 to further gain space on the queen side. And we have seen this plenty of times in the Manhattan section that these positions with the pawn on c4 is very good for black. So let's start with d into c5, which is not a good way at all for white because we have d4 and we are winning material. It creates an isolated pawn, which if we respond with bishop c5, yes, white is better after knight into d5, exploiting that the bishop on c5 is hanging, but we can counter attack and exploit white's king in the center. The only way for white to keep the piece is with a3, but after dc3, ab4, queen d1, rook d1, c into b2, we have a very dangerous pawn on b2, and if white tries to win it with rook b1, we have the very smart a5, exploiting that rook b2 doesn't work due to a b4, and the rook penetrates right into the first rank, or else we'll play knight c6 and keep this passed pawn. If white plays b5 here, then all of a sudden we have a3, rook b2, sorry, a4, rook b2, and a3. And this rook can't move to a2, trying to blockade the pawn because we have bishop e6, getting our minor piece into the game. And after rook a1, a2, this pawn is clearly very dangerous. We have a protected passed pawn on the 7th rank of the board, and this should be clearly winning for us. Therefore, instead of all this, white's best try is to play e3. White opens up the diagonal for the bishop, and defends this pawn. But we now use the standard and already known trick of playing bishop c3, meeting rook c3 with c4 and grabbing space in the center. Now we have two plans, the typical b5 b4 or g5 knight e4 queen a5 check. And we have seen these kind of position multiple times, and by now I hope you all get the reason why black is better. Let's go back to the sixth move sidelines, where whites also can play a3, forcing us to take on c3, which we happily oblige because we spoil white's pawn structure in the process. And after bc3, we play the typical bishop f5, hoping that after e3, bishop d3, we are able to trade our worst placed piece in the QGD. And this is also a very comfortable position for us. And our plans include playing knight d7 and c5, looking to attack these weaknesses with queen a5, rook c8, or maybe knight e4 if the queen is on a5. And let's go back to the critical sideline, which is queen b3. This move is a bit rare. It's been played, but not so much. But now I think it's one of the most testing lines for white in terms of it being a sideline. Now that I say it, at the time of recording, there have been multiple new games in this line with Jordan Van Forest playing this as white, who's one of the topmost theoreticians. And then there is Blue Bomb Matthias playing it as well, who's another very good theoretician. Both of them played it at the World Cup, which means people are starting to respect this line as we get deeper and deeper into new territories. After queen b3, white's idea is obvious. White wants to play bishop f6 and queen d5 or win our bishop on b4. How do we stop both the plans? By defending b4 with c5, and at the same time, we are challenging white's center. We already know that when the queen moves, this pawn is a bit more vulnerable, which we try to exploit in most of the cases with c5. White has two critical moves here, which is to defend the pawn with e3 or playing dc5. Okay, by the way, e3, knight c6, dc5 transposes to the main line, which we'll check in a couple of minutes. If white tries to play knight f3 and defend this pawn, the issue is that we have the typical c4 gaining space and we win a tempo. After queen c2, we want to play h6 with the typical g5, knight e4, queen a5 ideas, basically the ideas which we saw in the Manhattan. We have a better version of the Manhattan because our knight is on c6, not on d7, which means this bishop on c8 is not restricted and might come to f5 or g4 with knight e4. And we have one extra tempo with c5, c4. So let's go back to move 7. If white plays a3, challenging our bishop, we again play bishop c3, queen c3, and by now the very typical c4, gaining space, and we want to play b5, a5, and gain further space on the queen side. If white plays knight f3, knight c6, and white basically has to choose between dc5 and e3, both of which transpose to the main line, which we'll check now. I ask you to please pay attention to this line because this is very critical. c5, dc5, knight c6. We don't spend time on bishop c5 because we have an isolated pawn, right? So if white is able to develop comfortably and finish kingside development, white should be better. We have a structural defect. What do we have in compensation? The weak white king, and after knight c6, the activity of our pieces. We have 3 minor pieces developed compared to white's 2. So we have a slight lead in development, which we are trying to exploit. White now has 2 critical tries. There is e3, long castle, and then there is knight f3, which is the main line of this chapter. Let's start with e3. So white tries to open up the diagonal for the bishop, and white wants to play knight f3 and short castle. The issue for white is that we have the very strong bishop e6 trying to exploit white's poor positioning of the queen. Now, if the queen moves back, white has spent time, and then what we can try to do is castle, knight f3, and now we can take on c5. Usually these structures are good for white, but by now white has bishop e2 and castle included typically in these positions. But at this particular moment, white doesn't get that in time because after bishop e2, we start off by playing h6. As we know, this is a very useful inclusion to have. And after bishop h4, we don't allow white the time to attack the d5 pawn and cover d4, the typical break in isolated pawn structures, and we play d4 ourselves. And after this, we keep a slight advantage due to the better positioning of the pieces. This d5 d4 is a very typical idea in isolating pawn positions where you are basically exchanging of your weakness and in return keeping a slight advantage in activity of your pieces. Let's go back. And thus e3 is not that great. White probably has, okay, so the two critical lines is long castle and knight f3, bishop e6, long castle. We'll start by checking direct long castle where white is attacking this pawn and is no longer in a pin on this diagonal. How do we meet this? We meet this by playing queen a5, getting our queen out of the pin. So we might have some bishop c3, bc3, knight e4 ideas, preparing queen c5 and bishop c3 at the same time. Basically, if we also have the idea of pushing d4 and getting bishop e6 in, attacking the queen. So we are ready to launch an attack too, which means white needs to take on f6 and stop us from our crusade in the center. If white plays knight d5, white is just lost after queen into c5 because king b1 allows us to bring all of our pieces into the attack, and we play bishop f5 check, king a1, and exploit that after bishop c2, white is losing material. If white plays queen c2, trying to trade off the queens, we happily take because after king c2, bishop f5, white's king doesn't have a good square to run to. If you play king b3, there is knight into d5, rook into d5, bishop e6, winning material due to the pin. And if the king goes back to c1, we can just play rook c8 and use that the king is under deep trouble due to the potential discovered check on the c5. And thus, white probably needs to play bishop f6, which actually makes a lot more sense strategically, because after gf6, white has spoiled our pawn structure on the king side and somewhat tries to exploit that our king is not great either. As usual, we are preparing to play d4 and bishop e6 and start attacking on the queen side, so white needs to be fast. There are two critical moves, a3 and knight d5. Let's start with a3, where white forces us to take and get the queens off the board. But this makes white's pawn structure weak too, and we play the typical bishop e6, defend this pawn. Now this position is very balanced, but both sides have some endgame triumphs. White for one has a bit, is looking to claim that we have a poor pawn structure and we are a pawn down. But our claim is that after king e7, in endgames, we want to keep our king in the center because there is no real attack coming out, and white doesn't have a dark square bishop too, so these weaknesses really don't matter. We want to play king e7, knight d5, rook a c8. And then we want to win this pawn on c5. We will win this back, and then we'll try to target these weaknesses on the king side with getting the other rook in and jumping around with the knight. The position is very balanced, but I think it's a playable position and you need to show good technique from both the sides to hold or maybe increase pressure in this position. This is going to be a long game, no doubt, but both sides have their chances and the better technical player will win here. Let's go back. to this position with e3. White, okay, e3 is possible and white is opening up the diagonal for the bishop, but we have the typical bishop e6 with the idea of playing d4. I'm sorry for that. If and so white needs to play knight d5 and stop us from playing d4. King b1 runs into long castle, and we are again threatening d4, so white needs to play knight d5 and transpose to the main line of this chapter. Knight d5, and what do? We play castle, safeguard our king, not castle, but long castle by the way, put our king on a better square, and bring a new piece into the attack. Now this knight on d5 is vulnerable, and we are looking to win it by playing queen into c5 check. Although we are a couple of pawns down, we are going to recover one of them back, but we have the pair of bishops and a great lead in development. I don't see any problem for us in this position. I think from a practical viewpoint, the position is very rich, but as usual, I prefer black because we are making threats. Let's go back to this position with knight into d5. White doesn't spend time on e3. How do we react to this? By playing queen into c5 check, and white's only move is queen c2. As usual, king b5 is bad because after bishop f5, king a1, we have long castle and we have way too many threats. There is bishop c2, there is knight d4, there is bishop e6, there is bishop e4. This is hanging, this and this are weak, and there is some back rank ideas. White is playing 3 pieces down for practically, and that gives us a great chance to exploit white's poor positioning of pieces. So white needs to play queen c2. Knight c3 isn't great either because it's way too passive, and we just get our pieces in with bishop e6, queen c2, rook c8. We are now threatening bishop c3 and knight b4, and basically white is busted on the queen side. There are too many threats. All of our pieces are flowing in, right? Except the rook on h8, everything is attacking, while for white, these 3 pieces are not contributing in the game at all. That's why they say initiative over material. So queen c5, queen c2. So white keeps some hope in the position and asks us to trade off the queens so that the attack is less dangerous. We have no option but to take, and after king c2, we play the typical bishop f5 check, get a new piece into the game with a tempo. Now we have 3 pieces developed while white has just 1 minor piece, and so we have enough compensation. White's best try is king c1. If white plays king b3, we just play castle, and we are going to exploit the potential pin on the d file as well as the g8, a2 diagonal. So white's best bet is king c1, and this is a very important moment in this position. We are a pawn down, but we have great lead in development. However, our pawn structure is weak, but we have pair of bishops. Now white wants to play. White has 2 ideas here. There is f3 e4 to shut down this bishop, and if white is able to do that, white remains better because this knight on d5 is amazing, and without the light square bishops, our threats wouldn't be so great because the king would be able to run to b1. The other idea could be to play e4 directly. Of course, there is knight c7 check here. E4 runs, we can't play bishop e4 due to knight b4, and then 2 threats of rook d4 or rook e1. And there is a threat of knight into f6 check. So these are white's threats. Now the threat of knight f6, knight c7, e4 is most critical. And how do we solve all of these 3 problems at once? By playing king f8. A very strange but a very strong move. We get out of all the threats. Knight f6 is not a check anymore. E4 is not good because we can play bishop e4 since there is no pin here. And basically there is knight c7 is not a fork either. If we play the natural rook c8, the issue was that after knight f6, there is a check, and king e7 runs into e4, where white has a small edge. We can't retreat back with the bishop due to knight d5 being a check, and if we play king f6, ef5, white is better due to the extra pawn. And so after king f8, we get rid out of knight f6 check ideas, and now we are planning to play rook c8. The main line is of course knight into f6, but let's see what happens to the f3 e4 plan. We meet f3 with rook c8 now. Since knight f6 is not a check, we get our last piece into the game. If white plays e4 to play king b1, now white is a pawn up, so we must be quick and use this window of opportunity. Otherwise, white will remain better due to extra pawn and better pawn structure. We have to start with knight e7 check. White plays king b1, and now we take on d5. We are using the moment to say that ef5 is not working due to knight e3, and we win material. And if white plays rook d5, now we play bishop e6. And because these pieces are not developed, we have sufficient compensation. Rook cannot move to b5 due to bishop d2 and the threat of rook c1 mate. If white plays knight e2, this bishop won't be developed. So white probably plays rook d1, gets back with the bishop, and now we play king e7. And this is a good moment to stop. We are a pawn down, no question about that. But we have great pair of bishops and we have great activity. Our idea is basically that since these pieces are not developed, we'll exploit our window of opportunity and play rook d8 and get one of our rooks to d2. If by any chance, let's say white got knight e2 and I'm making some random moves just to prove our point, white gets a chance to play this, we are still fine because after this we have some opposite color bishops on the board and we'll still enter. So even if white gets 2 extra moves, we are fine. Here, we just won't allow white that much time and just play rook d8 immediately. White can't stop us from penetrating with rook d2 or rook d1, where we will have sufficient compensation. Alright, so this king f8 move is super critical to remember, and I would ask you to just go through the plans once again. The logic of playing king f8 is more important than the concrete move, but it's important you don't mess it up in a game by just remembering that you have to play king f8 at some point when knight d5 comes. The logic that you're getting rid of all the 3 threats at once was more important. So this f3 is good for white, but we are fine as well. If white plays e3, we play the typical rook c8. White's idea was that white wants to meet this discovery threat with knight e2, but we have the very strong bishop a5 here. We can't move the knight here due to knight ec3, and suddenly white has nothing to be worried about, and the threats of f3, e4 are back in the air. But with bishop a5 being prophylactic against knight c3, we are completely fine. The point is that if white plays knight c3, we have knight d4 and we recover a pawn. Sorry. Yeah, if white plays knight b4, we have bishop b4 and we'll win back a pawn. And if white doesn't do that, we have the threat of knight into a2 check, winning the game. This position is a bit dull, I'll give you that, but this line as of now is not so popular, and we can try to use that to our favor. Of course, as black, you can't have a promising position in every single line. We have already discussed that, but we are trying to give ourselves the maximum chances and see if our opponent takes the bait and goes for a complicated position. So knight d5, queen c2, queen into c5 check, queen c2, takes bishop f5 check, king c1, and we play king f8. The critical move is knight into f6. White wins the second pawn. How do we deal with this? By playing bishop e7, so that e4, we meet e4. If white plays knight d5, now we have vacated this square for our knight, which is very super useful for us. And after knight b4, we are much better. White needs to play the passive knight c3, where we will play rook c8 and have ideas of knight a2. This king will be very much in danger. And if white plays knight into b4, we just have rook c8 check, exploiting that the king has to run to d2. And after bishop b4 check, the king is in grave danger. And so we are playing bishop e7 here and not rook c8 because of e4. Bishop e7, the point is if white plays e4, now we have bishop g6. And basically this knight is attacked. So if the knight moves, now we win a pawn. So we have recovered one pawn. In return, we'll have to give up our bishop pair. But after knight e7, we have a new threat of rook c8 check and penetrating with the rook. The only way white holds it, not the only way, but the strongest way white holds it with is with knight e2, where we use the activity of our pieces to recover the pawn. We start by playing rook c8 check. White has to play knight c3 because king d2 runs into rook c2 check, and we'll win the b2 pawn in some time. Or else we will have a great attack after king e3, bishop c6 with the knight. The knight jumping around is clearly very dangerous for white. And if white plays knight c3, we'll again use this pin and play knight d5, followed by knight into c3. White can try to keep the pawn, which we'll meet with knight c3, bc3. And now the only piece that isn't in the game is the rook. So we'll play rook g8 with the idea of getting the rook into the game with rook g6 and rook d6. White has clear weaknesses in the position, and so we'll be able to recover one of the pawns and then reach an equal endgame. Not the most desirable result, but we are black, and if white plays this precisely, we don't have much to do here. So this is one of the lines which I would recommend white players to try out, because black players might not know it in great depth, and this is quite testing for black. So maybe in general, if you play new ideas, right, from both colors, it's best because your opponents might not be aware and you get a chance to catch them in in lines which they don't know and in complicated positions. The play for black wasn't very straightforward. It's natural but not straightforward. There are deviations. So I would ask you to pay close attention to this variation. And let's go back to check the last critical main line here with 8th knight f3, where we play bishop e6. We are threatening d4, and now white plays long castle. Queen c2 is bad because now you are wasting unnecessary time in the opening, and you have played queen b3 and queen c2, which shouldn't be good. We just play h6, win a tempo. The bishop goes back, and now we play bishop c5. Again, we are better due to the activity of our pieces. If white had e3, bishop e2, and rook d1 in, white would have been better due to the poor pawn. But we'll get d4 in no time. And then we'll basically exchange off our weakness and remain better due to more active pieces. So white needs to play long castle here. And as usual, we play queen a5. Bishop f6. White has no other response. And we are threatening d4. So white needs to play this. Gf6, knight d5. We have seen this with the e3 line. And now we play queen into c5 check. Note that long castle doesn't work here due to e4, and white doesn't spend time on e3. So white gets e4 in one shot, and now d5 is much more safer, and thus we can play long castle, and we need to play queen c5. White needs to play queen c2 because king b1 allows us the typical counterplay with bishop f5 check, king a1, long castle, where we are threatening bishop c2. White survives with e4, but it's no fun for white. So we come back and check white's main line with queen c2. And here, queen into c2 is possible, but I don't want to play that and rather play long castle directly. We finish our development and threaten to win this piece. White's best bet is to play e4 If white plays queen c5, we are very happy because this allows us to bring in the bishop to attack this pawn. We have discussed this concept where we want our opponent to take pieces, especially the central ones, so that a new piece comes into the center and we have a piece which is activated. The bishop on b4 was inferior than the bishop we have on c5, so we are very happy with this trade. If white plays e4, defending the d5 knight, we can just play f5 and both these pieces. Sorry, there are plenty of pieces which are in danger in white's possession. If white plays bishop d3, we just use that this bishop pawn is now hanging and get a new piece into the game and renew these threats. In general, we have great activity here, and your plan is just to win one of the pawns in the position. So white's best bet is to play e4, defend the knight, and open up the diagonal for the bishop. How do we deal with this? By counter-attacking and looking to undermine white's center. White's best bet is bishop d3, looking to meet fe4 with bishop e4 and keeping this knight in the center. If white plays bishop c4, we have f into e4, where queen into e4 doesn't work due to the tactical motive of the pin, and after b5, we are winning. So, although bishop looks good on c4, it doesn't work due to this tactical motive, and after bishop d3, there is some pressure along this diagonal from both the ends. We don't want to release pressure, which is a good trade of strong players, where you wait and keep pressure even though it feels uncomfortable, because it's the strongest thing to do. So how do we keep pressure in this position? White is threatening knight into b4, and we don't want to give up the bishop. What do? King b8. The point is, if white plays knight b4, we'll play queen b4, and now there are discovery threats. If white plays king b1, we have the strong tactical shot of rook into d3. Exploiting that, we win a piece here. So after king b8, white has two moves. There is king b1, and there is a3. If white plays king b1, getting out of the c file and seemingly the danger by themselves, we take on e4 now, release the pressure, because now we have the threat of bishop into d5. And since the king is on b1, queen into c5 runs into bishop e4, check. So what do I mean by that? If bishop e4, bishop d5, queen into c5. Earlier we couldn't play bishop c5 due to bishop d5, but here we have the nice intermezzo since bishop into e4 is a check, and we win an extra piece. And so white is forced to release the tension with queen into c5. But after bishop into c5, bishop e4, we can just win the pawn with bishop f2, and we are completely all right. But this allows knight g5, and white has some very good drawing chances. So I want to play f5 with the idea that this bishop cannot retreat due to bishop f2. And after knight g5, I want to play bishop c8, followed by bishop f3. If the bishop goes back to c2, we get the rook into the game, and the position is very good for us. If the bishop comes back to f3, we want to play knight e5. This pawn is hanging anyways. We have the pair of bishops, and we want to play knight f3, bishop f2. Be mindful of knight f7, but we have great compensation in the position. Even if we are pawn down, let's say with rook h1, knight f3, gf3, even if we are a pawn down, we can play rook e8, and we have plenty of chances since these pawns are very loose. We have the pair of bishops, so any ending would be difficult for white to defend. It's right now white's fine because of the extra pawn, but it can get unpleasant for white very soon, and we are not really risking anything because we'll have plenty of opportunities to liquidate and go in an equal endgame. So that brings us to an end for this line with king b1, and we go back to white's 15th move where white plays a3. The idea is white wants us to play queen c2 and release the tension, but we play the very strong queen a5, revealing the secondary idea of king b8, which was to exploit white's weak king. White obviously can't play A into b4 due to knight into b4, knight b4, rook c8, losing material. While knight into b4 also runs into knight b4, a b4, queen b4, where due to the threats of rook c8, bb3, and queen a4, white's king is in a mating zone. And thus, white needs to play bishop c4 to hold the balance. This defends d5, maintains tension, and blocks the c file. Both sides are maintaining tension. Now we are down on material and this is hanging, so we need to do something about it. And we have to launch a forced sequence of moves with bishop a3. We spoil white's queen side pawn structure with the very concrete f into e4 in the mind. Now this is hanging and this is hanging, so white needs to play queen e4. And queen a3 is possible, but let's get the last piece into the game with rook h e8. A very good attacking idea is to get all the pieces into the game so there are more threats and then start attacking. Before playing queen a3, we just ensure that our last piece comes in with a threat. The threat is to play bishop into d5, and so white can't easily defend queen a3. White's best idea is to play rook h e1 and bring their last piece into the game, threatening to meet bishop d5 with queen f4 check, king a8, rook a3. This is also a draw after queen a3, but at least that's what white's trying to do. If white plays queen f4 instead of rook h e1, after king c8, the threat of bishop d5 is unpleasant to face. White holds, but we have a perpetual at the very minimum or an equal ending. If white plays queen d3, white is already actually worse. White is trying to defend this, but lands into a pin, and after bishop d5, knight e7, we recover a piece and also keep the attack. Our king is very safe, while white's king is not, so black actually has a decisive attack. And that brings us to rook h e1, white's best idea. Now, we have seen that bishop d5 works as well, but I want to start with queen a3, and only after king b1, I want to play bishop d5. White can't play queen e8 here, because after queen a4 check, king a1, queen into c4, we keep the idea of rook e8, but we also have a mating idea in mind. And if white plays queen e2, trying to defend against both of the ideas, we have queen a4 check, followed by knight b4, and the attack is very dangerous. So I'm trying to give white chances to go wrong, and maybe we'll get a winning idea. But if white plays well, and after bishop d5 plays queen f4 check, we have nothing better to play king a8, and after rook e8, we play queen b4 check and accept a perpetual. White can't play king c2 because, okay, king c2 is possible. If white plays this, we always have a perpetual. And for king c2, we play queen a4 check. White can't play king c1. Sorry, that was the point, because we have queen a1 check, king c2, and knight b4 check, where we are winning. The attack is dangerous, as after king b3, we have a forced mate after queen a2 check, king b4, queen b2 check, and this king can't run to a4 due to bishop c6 check. And after king a5, there are plenty of ways to win. I think there is b6, a6, bb7, which I find the cutest, but the rudimentary queen b6 is also a mate. Of course, white won't go into this and maybe accept the perpetual, because after king b2, we can actually just give a perpetual, or we can try to continue playing for a win with queen d1. That was my intention, where we play whenever possible. Of course, this is going to end in a draw after rook d8, knight d8, and queen f5. But it's probably all the moves, the more accurate moves your opponent has to make, the more chances they have to go around. All right, that brings us an end to a very lengthy and a difficult chapter. Both sides need to show a good deal of accuracy in the main line, and the positions are extremely complicated at times or very simple. So you need to pay some attention to this chapter, and let's just recap this chapter for us. Let's go back to the starting point. If I'm being honest, I'll play this line as white against Gukesh QGD players. There is no objective problems for sure, but the chances of us misremembering lines here is high. So what I want you to do is to pay attention to all the concrete move order subtleties because there are many. The other lines were very intuitive, and because of that, the positions were very good, and I wasn't very bothered by that. But here, because the lines are tricky, there are some ideas work in one line, it doesn't work in the other. So you need to be very alert here. So let's sum it up. After bishop g5, bishop b4, we basically need to be bothered only with queen b3. White attacks d5 and b4. We challenge the center with c5, e3, or dc5, knight c6, e3, runs into bishop e6. A good way to memorize this line is to remember that you meet e3 with bishop e6 in most of the cases. Now this is completely fine. If white plays long castle without e3, a good way to note is that whenever white plays long castle, be it here or here, we want to play queen a5, right? So you're making some mind maps in the position and giving yourself some breadcrumbs to remember during the game in case you forget the line. Let's start with long castle, queen a5, bishop f6, gf6, knight d5. You play queen c5. Now king b1 is never good because of bishop f5 check. That's all you need to remember. And queen c2, you take and play bishop f5 check. Because white hasn't played e3, white doesn't have bishop d3 here. And after king c1, we can't play rook c8 due to the threat of knight f6 and e4. So the last critical move which you need to remember is to play king f8 with the idea of rook c8. And if you remember this much, you will get a good position in the game. Let's go back to knight f3, bishop e6. As usual, knight f3 with bishop e6, long castle, queen a5. We are looking to open up the queen side. White needs to play bishop f6, gf6, knight d5, winning a pawn. We play queen c5. King b1 is not good because of bishop f5 check. So white needs to play queen c2. Now, long castle, getting a new piece into the attack, safeguarding our king. And after e4, you need to remember f5. Bishop d3, and the very important king b8, looking to open up the c file for the rook, and at the same time maintaining tension in the center. There is a lot of conflict. Let your opponent dissolve it so that your pieces land upon better squares. And after a3, the last move which you need to remember is queen a5 with the idea of bishop a3 or rook c8. All right, guys, we come to an end to this important chapter. And this was basically the last critical line in the Gukesh QGD. And I'll see you in the next chapter.